Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a topic that affects pretty much every single one of us who loves to travel and, genuinely wants to do it responsibly. We're taking a hard look at the hidden ethical complexities behind those feel-good eco-vacations we constantly see advertised. On the surface, booking a sustainable tour feels like an absolute win, right? But as we're going to see today, genuine sustainable development is always about ethics. And, ethics are rarely simple. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. So we're going to peel back the layers of the sustainable tourism industry and discover a reality that is actually full of competing values.
Which brings us to a rather uncomfortable question. Is your eco-friendly vacation actually doing more harm than good? Now, I am definitely not asking this to make you feel guilty about your next trip, but really to challenge a super simplistic assumption we all tend to make. We generally think that just slapping a sustainable or eco-friendly label on a trip means it's this flawless, perfect solution to the well-known disasters of mass tourism. But the truth is, when we travel, we pack a whole suitcase full of our own cultural, economic, and ethical assumptions. And sometimes, those assumptions clash directly with the reality on the ground.
Let's start right at the surface layer. The core promise of sustainable tourism is to offer small-scale development that steps in to replace or at least limit the incredibly unethical excesses we associate with mass tourism. For decades now, we've known that mass tourism can be culturally tone-deaf and literally devastating to indigenous communities and local environments. Sustainable tourism stepped up as the hero here, promising a much more environmentally aware and culturally acceptable form of travel. Sounds absolutely perfect, right? But what actually happens when we peel back that very first layer?
That brings us to layer one, the global development divide. Think about the massive global tug-of-war playing out right now. On one side of the rope, you've got industrialized nations. These countries often look at further industrialization and rapid economic development in the global south as a huge global environmental threat. Essentially, they argue that developing nations need to curb their industrialization for the greater environmental good. But flip to the other side of the rope, developing nations often look at this stance as a massive double standard. They rightly point out that developed countries built their own wealth by causing most of the current environmental problems in the first place, and now they're the least willing to actually provide the financing to fix them. For a lot of developing nations, strict environmental sustainability feels like a luxury they literally cannot afford, simply because it blocks their own crucial survival and development.
In developing countries, environmental degradation isn't just some abstract, theoretical debate about carbon footprints. It is a day-to-day survival issue, period. For countries that rely on exporting crops and raw materials, any damage to their natural resources directly tanks their crop yields and national income. It immediately hits the rural dweller who relies on that water, land, and wood just to stay alive. So governments are desperately looking for a middle ground. And tourism? It's increasingly promoted as the golden ticket. It's a way to earn vital foreign exchange to survive while supposedly conserving the environment by attracting tourists from the global north who just want some sunshine, beaches, and pristine nature.
But creating that pristine, untouched nature leads us straight into our next conflict. Layer 2, the cost of picture perfect.
To really get this, we need to talk about a concept called the tourist gaze. Tourism operators deliberately project this magical image of a destination. They want it to look like this untouched paradise just waiting to be discovered by tourists from industrialized nations. And to pull this off, companies essentially package whole communities as a single tourism attraction. The expectation is that international visitors are going to be greeted purely by smiling, welcoming faces. But to maintain this flawless illusion, the messy, complex aspects of local society and politics are intentionally hidden entirely out of sight from the tourist gaze.
So you end up with this incredibly stark contrast between the packaged image and the hidden reality. On one hand, you have the brochures, smiling, welcoming locals eager to share their pristine paradise. But on the other hand, right beneath the floorboards of that luxury eco-lodge, there are very often indigenous groups actively fighting for land claims in those exact same tourist areas. Tourism development essentially turns into a localized power struggle. You've got one powerful interest group, the government and private tourism industry, trying to dictate exactly how that space should be used, and meanwhile another, usually much less powerful group, is resisting that control.
And here's where it gets really problematic. To keep that perfect, peaceful tourist gaze intact, governments and private industries will frequently rebrand those indigenous groups fighting for their land as disruptive or disloyal. Because, let's be honest, the tourist just wants a simple, beautiful, ethical experience. The incredibly messy reality of indigenous land rights just gets swept right under the rug. The very act of creating an untouched eco-paradise for the visitor can sometimes literally mean marginalizing the very people who have lived on that land for centuries.
Okay, let's peel back another layer, and I'll warn you, this is where things get deeply counterintuitive. Layer 3, conservation versus animal rights.
First, we have to understand how local communities actually interact with wildlife. It's usually governed by something known as usufruct rights. What this means is that the wildlife isn't strictly owned by the community in a traditional Western capitalist sense. Instead, it's utilized by them as a resource held within a group system. Wildlife policy in these regions is typically built around the concept of sustainable utilization, basically treating wildlife as a commodity that can generate the revenue needed to meet the basic needs of rural people. The goal here is to strike a workable, ethical balance between wildlife conservation, human development, and the humane treatment of animals.
But here is the massive paradox. Modern tourists increasingly look at nature strictly through the lens of animal rights. We want completely ethical, non-consumptive relationships with elephants, lions, and rainforests. But can protecting individual animals actually harm the environment? I know, it sounds totally backward, doesn't it? How on earth could saving an animal be bad for nature?
Well, let's walk through this step by step, using elephants as our example. Step 1. Western tourists and animal rights advocates demand the strict preservation of every individual animal. Step 2. Because of this heavy protection, certain wildlife populations, like elephants, can multiply and reach excessive numbers. Step 3. Because there are suddenly way too many elephants in a confined, fenced-in ecosystem, the available food and water get rapidly depleted. Step 4. Other critically important species are literally forced out of the ecosystem, which ultimately tanks the overall biodiversity of the area. So, by strictly applying an animal rights framework just to save every single individual elephant, we might accidentally trigger the ecological collapse of the entire reserve.
This right here captures the ultimate tension. Satisfying basic human needs and respecting the intrinsic value of individual animals are very frequently two completely opposing and incompatible concerns. The modern idea of animal rights actually gets a lot of pushback from ecologists. Why? Because human interference, specifically in the form of environmental management and resource utilization, is sometimes absolutely required to ensure certain animal populations don't literally eat their own environment to death. It is a massive clash. You have the tourist's desire for an untouched ethical relationship with an animal, slamming right into the ecological requirement for biodiversity, which unfortunately sometimes requires culling or utilization.
So, where does all of this leave us? Layer 4, navigating the ethical maze. To sum it all up, there is simply no single easy magic bullet that's going to satisfy everyone. We are constantly navigating value conflicts. We've got the desperate need for economic growth in the global south clashing head-on with demands for global environmental care. We've got the desire for a beautiful, packaged tourist image clashing with the messy, vital reality of indigenous land rights. And we've got the emotional appeal of individual animal rights clashing with the cold, hard science of maintaining maximum biodiversity. These economic, ethical, and aesthetic values are constantly bumping into each other. Sometimes they combine beautifully, sure, but very often they clash dramatically.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. When you pack for your next eco-tour, whose ethics are you really carrying with you? Are you bringing what's best for the global environment? What's best for the local indigenous community's survival? Or simply what makes you feel best as a tourist? Genuine sustainable development requires us to look past the smiling faces and the glossy, pristine brochures and actually engage with the incredibly difficult, sometimes entirely contradictory realities on the ground. So keep that in mind the next time you book a trip. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the hard questions.